Hi, I'm Colby, and today I want to talk about spin-offs. So spin-offs are often like a appealing option for intellectual property that is really expansive in world building. Stuff like Harry Potter or Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or Marvel. Stuff where it's like, let's explore this really cool world with a different character and a different perspective. However, there are a lot of pitfalls that can happen when exploring a spin-off. So the first pitfall is just eliminating mystery. A lot of times what makes something cool is the fact that there's mystery. So the classic example is someone like Boba Fett. In the original Star Wars films, he's really cool because he has such few lines. You don't know what he's thinking, so you're forced to think about it. And something like that is something where fans can like coalesce and talk about, and it makes the audience part of the process. They get to decide his backstory, and they get to interpret how he acts and stuff like that. But when you have a spin-off, you eliminate all of that mystery. So honestly, even if the story is really good, you can actually kind of still hurt it by eliminating some of the mystery. And instead of making it a fun part where the audience gets to be part of it, it's now just kind of a thing that happened, and it's another thing for them to memorize. Another pitfall with spin-offs, and I'll stick with Star Wars here, is that you can just flatten characters. So in the original Star Wars arc, Han Solo goes from this renegade rogue character who kind of has a shady past, and that's an important part of how he starts out, because he has this redemption arc where he decides to fight for the rebellion, and it's more powerful because of where he started from. However, with the Solo movie, it turned him into just always kind of a good guy who maybe was slightly misunderstood. And that means that the original character arc that he has is kind of flattened, because if he starts out in episode 4 as, you know, a pretty good guy who maybe is a bit misunderstood, then he ends with just barely even moving on the character arc story. Another pitfall that can happen when doing a spin-off is dramatically recontextualizing a scene in the original material. So again, another Star Wars example is in Solo. After the events of that movie, you find out that the Millennium Falcon is actually a sentient robot who's lovers with Lando, which means that when Han Solo and Lando meet in episode 5, their meeting makes no sense because his reaction should be way different if Han Solo has basically stolen Lando's lover, and it's weird, man. It's a weird reaction.
We've got L3.
She's interfacing.
L3 is constructing a model of the Maelstrom. She says we're approaching the mall.
Guts coming here. After what you pulled.
This kind of also happens with Rogue One, where at the end of that, then it would mean that in episode 4, Leia had been running away from them, and so then when she's like pretending that she has no idea, it makes it seem like a really, really bald-faced lie. So it's not the end of the world, but it's a bit of a discontinuity.
Several transmissions were beamed to the ship by rebel spies. I want to know what happened to the plans they sent you.
I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a member of the Imperial Senate on a diplomatic mission to Alderaan.
Sir, we're detecting a massive object emerging from hyperspace.
The rebel flagship is disabled, my lord, but has received transmissions from the surface.
And that goes into my next point of when you try to fix plot holes, sometimes you can just open up way more plot holes. It also means that if you fix a plot hole, it now just means that the audience will want to nitpick even further and find out other problems. So even though maybe Rogue One, which was a good movie, it fixed this potentially plot hole of how did they even get these plans, you also wonder about other situations like, well, what the hell is happening with the Dagobah time issue? And if you tried to make a spin-off that fixed that, it would just draw even more questions into the problem. Where, like, yes, there was a plot hole, but it's not that big of a deal. And I think making a spin-off turns plot holes into even bigger deals than they are. Whereas a lot of times we can just move on because the movies are good despite that, and you don't need to fix every single issue with them. And the fifth pitfall that can happen when you're trying to do a spin-off is using a character who has a very famous actor. And it means that whoever plays him next is just going to be immediately compared against this other actor. And that's usually not very fair for that character. So like Solo, it was never going to be a winning situation when you're compared against Harrison Ford. And even though that character is very appealing to try to do, unless you have some sort of different perspective or something, it's just going to look like a knockoff version of this other famous actor. So with all that being said, I want to actually pitch the value of reboots, because I think a lot of times reboots, they're seen as a cynical cash grab. They're seen as studios not wanting to take risks or be creative. And oftentimes that is true. Studios want to sit back and collect checks on IP that they know will be successful. But reboots are really popular and successful in plays and musicals. In the theater world, having reboots can often bring new life to an old script. And one way they do this is by choosing a unique, different perspective than the previous run or what the original material had. In the film world, Spider-Man's a really good example of a reboot done well. Even though it's a short time span, they've done about 4 different iterations, and they're all been really successful and popular. So we had the original Tobey Maguire. Andrew Garfield played Peter Parker quite different than Tobey's, and that provided an interesting different contrast, and it explored a new kind of perspective for the character. Similarly, Tom Holland had the MCU Spider-Man, and we were able to kind of explore Spider-Man as a sidekick to Iron Man and in conjunction with all these other superheroes. And so that also was an interesting way to go about it and different than the previous ways. And then of course, Into the Spider-Verse was totally different than all of that, and maybe the most original and probably the best out of all of those. And that was an example. It uses this old material, but it infuses new life into it. It accomplishes this by following a few things. And again, this is an art, not a science. So there's not a precise way to measure this. It's kind of just, good judgment. So first off, you want to remain true to the original material. You want to capture the essence of the character and the essence of the story. But simultaneously, you also want to infuse it with a different perspective and a different angle. You want there to be a reason to have the reboot. And so this often means that you need to have, explore these moral questions from a different perspective. Maybe you update them for a modern time. Christopher Nolan's Batman is a great example of this. Previous iterations, were pretty goofy. They had a lot of silly scenes. The costumes were over the top and campy, and it was just not really a serious film. So Christopher Nolan, he kept the essence of Batman. He kept the main characteristics and traits and that main story, but he updated it. He made it set in a real Gotham, one that felt like New York City, so it felt like it could actually happen to a certain extent. And then he also updated the moral questions. Instead of just focusing on the death of his parents and crime, he made it about terrorism, and he made it about the question about surveillance and how much is too much. What is ethical when we're trying to fight this evil that doesn't want anything in particular? And so that was really, really interesting, and audiences responded accordingly.
You've turned every cell phone in Gotham into a microphone. Spying on 30 million people isn't part of my job description.
Another way that reboots can be successful is questioning assumptions about the character themselves, making us ask questions that are fundamental about the character and reinterpret how we view that character. So for example, in the latest Batman film, this character now has to grapple with the idea that people are using his violence and vigilantism on social media, and they're coming to their own conclusions that maybe they should also be violent and use their own justice. And so this is both, an interesting moral question as far as the effects of social media and spreading disinformation, as well as Batman actually having to grapple with this assumption that we have about him, that he does violence, and what are the effects of that? And so that makes for an interesting film and interesting questions about the character. Fresh Prince is another example of an interesting reboot. They've kept the same intrinsic characteristics about these characters, they've kept the same facts, but they've changed it from a comedy to a drama. And there's a lot of interesting spaces to explore because of that. There's a lot of interesting examples too from films like Pride and Prejudice or Dracula, that there's many different versions of these films, and people try to explore different ways of having these characters. And I think that's really interesting. Now, don't get me wrong, there's definitely a lot of bad ways to do reboots, and oftentimes reboots are quite bad, and that studios assume kind of the wrong things about the characters, and they don't fully understand what's exciting and interesting about doing a reboot. So it's not nearly a guaranteed success. But I also think that a lot of times studios should really consider doing a reboot. I recently watched a YouTube video by Movie Flame, and he pitched rebooting Harry Potter, but as a TV show. And now this would allow them to explore the characters and be a lot more faithful to the source material in the books than they were in the movies. And it's able to explore a lot of the details and fun parts of the books that didn't make it into the movies. And I think that's a good example because the spin-off of Harry Potter fell into a lot of these issues. Anyway, those are my thoughts on reboots and spin-offs. I'd love to know what you think are the best reboots and the best spin-offs, so let me know in the comments. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.